Welcome to the Arizona SHRM Diversity Webinar Series, Developing Cultural and Ethnic Competence in Today's Workplace. Hello, Price. I'm going to be your facilitator today. My contact information is on the screen. Feel free to contact me at Price Consulting Group. My phone number is 252-622-8119, and you can reach me via email at drkellerbprice@gmail.com. I can also be found on social media at Kella Price. We have a lot to cover today, so let's get started. Just some rules for engagement for today's session. These are common rules that we would include in any kind of diversity or inclusion training to ensure, because sometimes it's a sensitive subject and we want to make sure everyone has a clear understanding of what the guidelines or rules are so that we can have productive conversations without inadvertently upsetting someone, because we can be talking about things that could be sensitive or particularly personal. Showing respect for others as learning, respecting each speaker even when we don't agree, listen carefully, trying not to generalize. Sometimes we do use generalizations, but knowing that those are exactly that, generalizations. There are always going to be people that fall outside that generalization or stereotype. We want to make sure we keep an open mind, because I have ideas I'm going to share with you that may be new or different. We want to make sure everyone has a chance to share their expertise, and as a result, we don't want to monopolize the conversation. And I encourage individuals to share via the chat, bringing out ideas, perspectives, or solutions. As we go through the training, if you have a question, please use the raise your hand tool and I will unmute you for that. So what is culture? Culture is defined as the shared traditions, beliefs, customs, history, folklore, and institutions of a group of people. Culture is shared by people of the same ethnicity, language, nationality, or religion. It's a system of rules that are the base of what we are and how it affects us, how we express ourselves as part of a group, as well as individuals. So we all develop in some type of culture. Our environment determines what we learn, how we learn it, and the rules for living with others. These rules are transmitted from one generation to the next, and sometimes can be adapted to times and locale. This is all elements of culture. Organizations also have a culture via their policies, procedures, programs, and processes, and incorporate certain values, beliefs, assumptions, and customs. Organizational cultures largely echo mainstream culture in terms of time orientation, perception, and use of time. An organization culture may not lend itself to cultural competence, and this is where skill building comes in, and we're going to talk about how to create an environment or a culture that encourages competency in terms of diversity and inclusion. So let's take a look more deeper at that. So looking at an iceberg, you know that only a small portion of the iceberg is what we see above the surface. Most of the iceberg is actually under the water. And the same goes for our culture. There are certain elements of our culture that maybe you can tell by looking at an individual. So you may be able to tell what ethnicity, or think you know what ethnicity someone is based on looking at them. Gender is part of your cultural identity. You may be able to tell what generation someone is from, but a lot of the factors could be under the surface. So myself as an example, I am a military spouse, an adopted mom of 4 adopted boys. I am a military spouse. I am a executive director for a pageant as Mrs. Arizona. And all of those are parts of my cultural identity, but you can't tell that by looking at me. You have to get to know the individual to see some of the underlying factors that make someone who they are and determine how you can leverage those differences as strengths in your organization. How does culture influence behavior? It's going to determine how we operate, learn, and treat others. It's also going to mirror our country's main cultural views in terms of time orientation, perception, and use of time. So when we talk about culture and ethnic competence, we have different levels of cultural competence or knowledge. A culturally competent organization brings together knowledge about different groups of people that work together, customers that they serve, and they use this information to develop standards, policies, and best practices. This ultimately, when you're effective at cultural and ethnic competence, creates a competitive advantage for your organization. So some of my goals for today's webinar is to identify areas of diversity that impact our success, examine the key principles of cultural competence, and discuss the tools and implementation strategies to make your organization culturally competent. So what is culture? We already talked about this. Shared traditions, beliefs, customs, history, shared by people of the same ethnicity or the same language, nationality, or religion. It's also a system of rules and who we are and how we express ourselves as part of a group as well as individually. So our environment impacts our behavior. All of us develop in some sort of culture, whether it was a certain family dynamic, a certain area of the country, your economic status. This environment determines what we learn, how we learn it, and the rules that we have for living with others. These rules are transmitted from one generation to the next, and as children, this develops who we are through how we perceive and see how the world does things. So thinking of your organization, we have different levels of cultural awareness or competence. The first being cultural knowledge. This is when we know about culture, history, values, beliefs, and behaviors of a cultural group. Cultural awareness is being open to the idea of changing cultural attitudes. Taking it a step further, cultural sensitivity is knowing that differences exist, but not assigning values of good or bad, right or wrong to those values. Sometimes we have internal conflict. We might be sensitive to someone's needs, but their values might be different than ours. So we have a personal conflict there. Ideally, we want our organizations to have cultural competence. This includes operational effectiveness. This is where we can bring together different behaviors, attitudes, and policies together for a certain synergy and work effectively in cross-cultural settings to produce better outcomes, more competitive advantage, and a more effective organization. So that's really where we want to be. Looking at the cultural competence model here, this is a non-threatening methodology because it acknowledges and validates who we are as people. Each part of our cultural identity is a part of us as an individual. But when we look at people, we focus on the organization's culture, it removes the need to place blame and assume guilt, since becoming culturally competent focuses on how to of aligning policies and practices within goals. Everyone is involved in the process. This inside-out model relieves the outsiders or excluded groups from the responsibility of adapting to the group as a whole. So a cultural competence model, looking here, it has 5 essential principles. Remember that it is non-threatening. It focuses on the how-to, aligning policies and practices with the goals. Everyone is going to be involved. As I mentioned, there are no outsiders, and we want to be able to better talk or relate to others within our organizations and have a total awareness of not only our own views, but views of others and culture. So with cultural competence, we have to have a full understanding of what our own views and practices are, but also those of other people, and have some sort of understanding and tolerance of those other cultures. There is also with cultural competence an element of continuous learning to be able to be more effective as a team and gain skills about how to work better with the people that are in your organization. So there's 5 principles of cultural competence: valuing diversity, conducting cultural self-assessment, understanding the dynamics of difference, institutionalizing cultural knowledge, and adapting to diversity. So let's look at each one of those a little bit more closely. Cultural competence requires that organizations have a defined set of values and principles and demonstrate behaviors, attitudes, policies, and structures that enable them to work effectively cross-culturally. We want to have the capacity to value diversity, conduct self-assessment, positively manage group dynamics, capture knowledge, and adapt to diversity in the cultural context of the communities that we serve. So looking at the cultural context of your organization, but also your suppliers, your end users, people in all areas, both internally and externally. Looking at that first principle, valuing diversity. This means that accepting and respecting differences between and within cultures. Sometimes we presume that common culture is shared between members of a racial, linguistic, or religious group, but this may not always be true. A group may share historical and geographical experiences, but individuals may share only physical appearance, language, or spiritual beliefs. Because remember, you have the context and the culture of your family that's an influence, perhaps the neighborhood that you grew up in, etc. All of these influence how we are. Our cultural assumptions can lead us to wrong conclusions. As people move to new areas and meld with other cultures, it creates really a kaleidoscope or a Heinz 57 view, if you will, of subcultures within racial groups. Gender, locale, socioeconomic status can all be elements and sometimes more powerful than racial factors. So I have a friend who is biracial, and they really struggle because they are light-skinned, but they identify as Black. But their comments to me are that they're too white to be Black and too Black to be white. They don't necessarily fit in racially with either cultural dynamic, and so they feel like they're often excluded from that perspective. So we need to be sensitive about these things. Another example is my son is part Mexican, and he has blonde hair and blue eyes and is very fair-skinned. Not typically what we stereotypically identify as a Mexican American. And he has been told on several occasions that he's not Hispanic. But I have told him, in contrast, to celebrate his heritage and that he knows who he is. But it's interesting that people have that stereotype of what you should look like if you are Mexican, and he doesn't fit that particular stereotype or generalization about that ethnicity. Looking at self-assessment. Conducting cultural self-assessment is one of the essential principles of the cultural competence model. The most important actions to be conscious of are usually the ones we take for granted. For instance, physical distance during social interactions varies by culture. If a staff member of an organization routinely touches the arm of someone that they're talking to, this could be misread in some cultures. Such miscommunication can be avoided if the organization does cultural self-assessment. In addition, each organization has a culture. Surveys and discussion can help members of that culture become more aware of the organization's way of how we do things as an organization and can help it to adjust to other cultures. This assessment is a continuing process towards cultural competence. The next element or principle of cultural competence is understanding the dynamics of difference. Many factors can affect how we interact cross-culturally. Bias due to historical cultural experiences can explain some of our attitudes or perceptions. Some groups, like, for example, Native Americans or African Americans, have experienced discrimination and unfair treatment from dominant cultures. Mistrust coming out of these experiences may be passed on to the next generations of these groups, but ignored within the dominant culture. So, an example of this is my recent experience talking to some of my Black friends and their experiences getting pulled over from the police and bias and how they're treated during a routine traffic stop and how they physically respond to that experience as compared to some of my white friends who are not of another ethnic group as a majority. How they are treated is markedly different. And when you survey and talk to different ethnic groups, their experience and how they're treated is also different. So some of that mistrust is reinforced through existing behaviors that we may not be aware of unless we actually ask the questions. We also want to be proactive. When we're planning to interact with different cultures, we need awareness of this dynamic if we want to be effective. Keep in mind also that our organizations are often intergenerational. A group that was generations have changed and levels of tolerance and understanding have changed over the years based on things that have happened in history. So a group that worked with an ineffective, culturally incompetent organization 15 years ago may not know that the group has the same name, but has new staff, new board, and a new approach to working with the community. So we have to be aware of the dynamic and perceptions from employees as well as the community at large. We also want to be proactive rather than reactive about changing to produce a more synergistic organization. Anticipating change is a basic dynamic in the development of synergy. And synergy is more than just being able to work in a team or a group. This is what really happens when people are truly working together, understanding each other deeply, and in total agreement about their beliefs and goals, at least as far as the work goes. Keep personal life personal, right? Synergy happens only if people treat each other with respect and are able to effectively communicate with one another. The next principle of cultural competency is knowledge management, institutionalizing that cultural knowledge. Cultural knowledge should be integrated into every facet of an organization. Staff must be trained and able to effectively utilize knowledge gained. Policies should be responsive to cultural diversity, and program materials should reflect positive images of all cultures. Our fifth and final principle of cultural competency is flexibility and adaptation to diversity. Values, behaviors, attitudes, practices, policies, and structures make it possible for more effective cross-cultural communication and guide a culturally competent organization. When we're able to recognize, respect, and value all cultures and integrate those values into the system, culturally competent organizations can meet the needs of diverse groups. Again, this is a competitive advantage. We are in a global work environment, so we're dealing with a variety of different cultures, and we in America are a very diverse in our makeup. So it's to our benefit to have that flexibility and adaptation. So what kinds of diversity do you see in your organization? There are all types of diversity in an organization. However, some types of diversity have a larger impact on organizations than others because they have historical significance. These types of diversity are associated with a history of inequity and injustice where not every person or group has been treated equally because of them. Some of these types of diversity include marginalized or socially excluded groups, nationality, ethnicity, native language, race, gender, sexual orientation, social class, spiritual beliefs and practice, physical and mental ability. Other types of diversity that should be considered but tend to be less salient include age, educational status, family status, health status, style, skills and talents, customs, ideas, military experience, national, regional, or other geographical area, ownership of property, occupational status, and socioeconomic status. So why is it important to be culturally competent? It is here, now. If your company or organization is not culturally competent, you are putting yourself at risk of going out of business. We're in a global environment. Diversity is reality. We're all connected through this globalization of communications, trade, and labor practices. Changes in one part of the world affect and have a ripple to people everywhere. Considering our increasing diversity and interconnected problems, working together seems to be the best strategy for accomplishing our goals. Would you not agree? Because social and economic change is coming faster and faster, organizations are understanding the need for cultural competence. We're realizing that if we don't improve our skills, we're asking for organization and cultural gridlock. Studies show that new entrants to the workforce and communities increasingly will be people of color, immigrants, and white women because of differential birth rates and immigration patterns. There are many benefits to diversity, such as rich resource of alternative ideas for how to do things, the opportunity for contact with people from all cultures, and nationalities living within our community and our target customers. The aid in strategizing quick response to environmental change, and a source for hope and success in managing our work and survival. So, how do we do this? Benefits of building an organization's cultural competence are increasing respect and mutual understanding among those involved. It increases creativity and problem solving through new perspectives, ideas, and strategies. It decreases unwanted surprises that might slow progress, increases participation and involvement of other cultural groups, increases trust and cooperation, helps overcome fear of mistakes, competition, or conflict. For instance, by understanding and accepting cultures, everyone is more likely to feel more comfortable in general and less likely to feel the urge to look over their shoulders because someone's out to get them, or fear of being inappropriate because they don't understand or are competent in other ethnicities. Promotes inclusion and equality. So we want to create this culturally competent organization. An organization is ready to become culturally competent when groups and potential leaders have been identified and the needs of cultural groups are identified. We have to know what we're working with. And the organization is open to learning and adapting to fit the needs better. This is not a check in the box. This is not a diversity class, one and done. We really want to look at what are the indicators of cultural competence. We have to be able in our organization to recognize the power and influence of culture. Being culturally diverse and inclusive gives us competitive advantage. We need to understand how each of our backgrounds affects our responses to others and anticipate those responses so that we can work better together as a team. We can't assume that all members of cultural groups share the same beliefs and practices. We have to acknowledge how our own past experiences affect our present interactions today. We have to be able to build on the strengths and resources of every culture within our organization. As an organization, we should be able to allocate resources for leadership, staff development, employee development in the area of cultural awareness, sensitivity, and understanding. We need to actively eliminate prejudice in policies and practices. We need to be willing to share power among leaders of different cultural backgrounds. We need to evaluate the organization's cultural competence on a regular basis. Cultural differences can either help or hurt how we function as organizations. So when we create multicultural organizations, we need to be able to deal with differences and use them to strengthen our efforts. So some of the best practices for building cultural competence. We want to make sure we start at the top. Top-down direction gives it a little bit more focus, and the employees are more likely to have a better buy-in. Getting everyone to buy-in can also be aided with a committee representing all levels of the organization. These types of committees can establish and facilitate action steps. If people at all organizational levels are involved, more people are likely to be influenced to become more culturally competent. But the process can be complicated. Some people, you may find a resistance to becoming more culturally sensitive. Some people might not understand why the issue is important, but we have to be mindful of this. Creating cross-department groups can assist with the communication flow. So let's create an action plan. We want to develop support for change throughout the organization, identifying who wants to change and maybe identifying individuals that need extra support because they're resistant to change. We want to identify the cultural groups to be involved. Who needs to be involved in planning, implementation, and reinforcement of the change? We want to identify barriers to working with the organization. What is currently not working? What will stop you or slow you down? We're going to assess the current level of cultural competence. Do we have the knowledge, skills, and resources that we can build on? Identifying gaps. These gaps we want to try to close or fill those gaps. Identifying the resources needed. How much funding is required to bring about change? Where can we find resources? We want to develop goals and implementation steps and deadlines for achieving them. Who can do what, when, and how? Finally, we want to commit to ongoing evaluation of our progress, because if we don't do that, we don't know if we're missing the mark or meeting our goals. We want to measure those outcomes and respond to change. We have to know, in order to do this, what our progress and success should look like and what are signs of whether or not we're on the right track. So some action steps that we want to do to build this multicultural organization. Form a committee. A cultural competence committee should have representation from all areas and levels of the organization. This committee can serve as a governing body for planning, implementing, and evaluating organizational cultural competence. We want to make sure that our mission statement commits to cultural competence as an integral part of all the organization's activities. The committee should be involved in developing the statement. We want to do some research and find out what similar organizations have done and develop partnerships to share best practices and leverage strengths. Why reinvent the wheel and spend all kinds of time and resources developing something if you don't have to? Other organizations may have already started developing and implementing culturally competent systems. Meet with those organizations, pick their brains, see if they'll continue to work with you to help you develop your cultural competence. Then adapt the processes and information that are consistent with your needs of your organization. Use free resources. Look for information available from federally funded technical assistance centers that catalog information on cultural competence. Get information. Attending this webinar is a great way or a great start to using resources. Do a comprehensive cultural competence assessment of your organization. We need to find which instruments best match the needs and interests of your organization. Then use assessment results to develop a long-term plan with measurable goals and objectives. This will help us incorporate culturally competent principles, policies, structures, and practices into all aspects of your organization. Among others, this may include changes in your mission statement, policies, procedures, administration, staffing patterns, service delivery practices, outreach, telecommunications, and information dissemination systems, as well as professional development activities. Find out which cultural groups exist in your community and if they access community services. Find out if these groups access services and if they are satisfied with what they're getting. Have a brown bag lunch meeting. This is a great way to get your staff involved in discussion and activities about cultural competence in a relatively informal setting. The object of this type of get-together is to get staff members or employees together to think about their attitudes, beliefs, and values related to cultural diversity and cultural competence. You can even invite a guest speaker. Provide training for your staff development needs. Find out what your organization's staff members perceive as their needs with regard to interacting with cultural groups in your organization or your customer client base. Next action step is to include any of these areas like training and meetings, to assign a part of your budget to programming and cultural competence. Commit to provide ongoing staff training and support for developing cultural competence by participation in conferences, workshops, and seminars. Include cultural competency requirements in your job descriptions. Cultural competency requirements should be apparent from the beginning of the hiring process. Discuss the importance of cultural awareness and competency with potential employees. Next, we want to make sure our facility's location is accessible and respectful of differences. An organization should be certain that the facility's location, hours, and staffing are accessible to disabled people, and that the physical appearance of the facility is respectful of different cultural groups. Be sensitive to the fact that certain seating arrangements or decor might be appropriate or inappropriate depending on a cultural group. Be aware of communication differences between cultures. In some racial and ethnic groups, for example, elders are highly respected, so it's important to know how to show respect in those groups. Collect resource materials on culturally diverse groups. We already talked about looking for free resources. There's many free online resources as well as printed materials. Visit the library and talk with people at similar organizations to learn about resources that they found as effective. Build a network of natural helpers, community informants or advisors, and other experts. These individuals have valuable knowledge of the cultural, linguistic, racial, and ethnic groups served by your organization. Effective organizations must do strategic outreach. They must do membership development. We should have set ground rules within our organizations that maintain a safe, nurturing environment. In addition, the structure and operating procedures we set should reinforce equity. Create leadership opportunities for everyone, especially people of color and women. Our organization should engage in activities that are culturally sensitive or that directly fight bias and domination by the majority culture. Looking at training, we have to make sure we understand all dimensions of our culture. Seeking commitment of those who are involved to nurture this cultural diversity. Again, having a culturally diverse environment and being culturally competent is a competitive environment, a competitive advantage in our global environment. We want to openly address and talk about myths, stereotypes, and cultural differences that interfere with a full contribution of members within different groups. Looking at organizational structure and operating procedures, we want to share the work and share the power. In our organizations, we should create systems that ensure equity in voice, responsibility, and visibility for all groups. The usual hierarchy with a group or leader in charge may create a power inequity. So create a decision-making structure in which all cultural groups have a voice at all levels. In our organizations, we should be finding ways to involve everyone using different types of meetings and their preferred communication strategies. We should develop operational policies and programs that confront and challenge racism, sexism, and other forms of intolerance. Conduct criticism, self-criticism of meetings is helpful to build a common set of expectations, values, and operating methods. In terms of communication, we need to be clear on what our expectations are. Communication is the basic tool that the organization can use to unite people. We need to use inclusive and valuing language and quote a diverse set of resources. We should learn and apply the cultural etiquette of our members and be able to learn to read different nonverbal behaviors. Do not assume that our employees all have a common understanding of and knowledge of unwritten rules. We should prohibit disrespectful name calling and the use of stereotypes, respecting and using personal names, using humor appropriately, laughing with each other, not at each other. If humor strikes a sour note, the person bothered should make their feelings known. I just recently read today, actually, in my Facebook feed about the changes coming to call sign designations for naval aviators. My husband is a naval aviator, and when you're going through flight school and you're in a squadron, everyone gets assigned a call sign. These are names that you don't get to pick. Typically, the name is given to you based on your personality, your physical attributes, or something really dumb that you did. So everyone has different call signs, and those are pretty much the protocol for how you get your call sign. And recently there was a suit filed against the Navy by 2 pilots who were relieved from flight status, complaining or stating that their call signs were racially discriminatory because they were stereotypes and racially fueled. So you need to just keep in mind, even though this is a historical thing that has been going on in the Navy for a long time, it's taken this long for someone to complain or speak up that they did not like or were offended by the name that they were given. We want to make sure we have commitment from our leadership. Our organization will become more connected with the community that it serves if we communicate publicly about the fact that diversity and inclusion is a top priority. We constantly need to continue to reevaluate the components that address awareness, understanding, communication, and nurturing of our culturally diverse organization. One of the ways that we can do that is by developing leadership opportunities as a way for leaders to work together in our organization. Having steering committees with different committee chairpersons is just one example or way that we can enable many people to function as leaders and encourage people to develop and leverage their own personal strengths to flourish in our organizations. This also encourages the interchange of leadership styles. If we include different types of people in leadership positions, we further promote the organization's multicultural vision and values. We want to cultivate new leadership by helping people gain confidence in new areas. These opportunities can be structured in shared tasks and mentoring by pairing up leaders with less experienced people so that skills are transferred and confidence increased. We also want to provide activities that integrate all aspects of different cultures. Most activities lend themselves to a multicultural approach, whether it's social events, sports, street fairs, talent shows, neighborhood improvement projects, demonstrations. We want to consciously develop projects that people from all cultures can work on together. We can conduct special activities to educate everyone about different cultural concerns, like forums, conferences, panels, and organized dialogues. If your activities within your organization are not attracting a diverse crowd, try running special events geared specifically to different groups, led and organized by representatives of those groups. Within your organization, the community populations should determine the issues and events that they feel are important. So don't assume that you know what's best unless you've asked your employees and gotten their feedback. Mentoring programs are another great way to bridge the gap and provide a type of training in a different environment to support cultures. Finally, I mentioned earlier that there are a number of resources and tools available to you. A lot of them are free and online, and here are some of the resources and tools that are really good. So my closing thoughts for today is that cultural competency is not something that's nice to do. It is an imperative for organizations within a global environment. It's imperative in our day and age when we live in a racially diverse and ethnic melting pot, when we have so many different experiences within our families and our communities based on our schools and our experiences. And the things that make us unique are things that provide us to bring a different perspective to our organizations and create that competitive advantage. When you can learn to appreciate and leverage those strengths in your organization, that is when you are truly winning and are a culturally competent organization. Again, we want to be operationally effective. We want to bring many different behaviors, attitudes, and policies to work most effectively in cross-cultural settings and produce the best possible organizational outcome. Thank you. If you have any questions, please put those in the chat window for me. And if you'd like to reach out to me privately, you do have my phone number here, 252-622-8119. You can email me at drkellabprice@gmail.com or find me on social media at Kella Price. Again, I'm Dr. Kella Price from Price Consulting Group, and I'm so happy to have spent this time with you for this diversity and inclusion webinar. Please join us next time. Thanks for joining us.